Since I'm still somewhat engaged with the Palestinian cause, today I'm bringing you an old story. This story could clarify to you that the Zionist dominance over this region isn't because there's some superpower or anything of the sort, but rather it's due to betrayal, treason, division, and the heartlessness of some people among us. The story of the Black September, and although it was a dark period, it will help you understand the truth behind the entire conflict. So let's dive into September. All right, let's go. After the Nakba in 48 and the defeat of the Arab armies, and after the Zionists took control at the time over most of the Palestinian lands, in that same year, 1948, the Palestinian leaders gathered to decide that they would ask Jordan to form a union with Palestine. And the king of Jordan would become the king of both Jordan and Palestine, and that was for several reasons. First, because King Abdullah I of Jordan, who ruled at the time and is the grandfather of the current King Abdullah II, was the one leading the Arab armies that were defeated in 1948. Even though they weren't actually real armies or anything, you could watch either of these two episodes and you'll understand how the game was played. Second, because this large area that escaped occupation was only separated from Jordan by the Jordan River, which is basically just a stretch of water. So geographically, Jordan was also the most suitable to take the lead. Jordan ratified the annexation of the eastern part of Palestine, which lies geographically on the western side of Jordan, in April 1950. The Jordanian king also decided to grant Jordanian citizenship to everyone there, and that explains why, even though this land is actually on the eastern side of Palestine, it's called the West Bank. If we look at the Jordan River, and given that this side is its eastern bank, so naturally the land located on the other side of the river would be the West Bank. And this also explains why the majority of Palestinians hold Jordanian citizenship. And of course, the Arabs here were divided around the decision to annex the West Bank to Jordan. But that's normal. I mean, when have they ever agreed on anything? You just hold on. You're about to witness disasters, I swear to God. And on July 20th, 1951, King Abdullah of Jordan went to perform prayers for the first time at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was then under his control and leadership. But he was met by a Palestinian man, Mustafa Shukri Ushu, who fired 3 bullets at the king's chest, abdomen and head. The shooting came after the leak of news that King Abdullah was preparing to sign a secret peace agreement with the Zionists. It's a long story and we won't dwell on it too much so we don't forget why we're here. We mentioned in the Oslo Accords episode that the Fatah movement was founded in 1957. In truth, the movement's operations were extremely painful for the Zionist entity from within the West Bank. So when the Zionists struck the movement in the 1966 attack on Samu, and precisely on February 13th, 1966, the Zionists didn't just strike inside Palestine, but rather they attacked Jordan and its sovereignty. And at that time, Jordan was under the rule of King Hussein, who was the grandson of King Abdullah, the one who was assassinated earlier in Palestine. So Jordan had its own reasons to participate in a war the very next year, which was the 1967 war. As for the question of whether Jordan truly participated in the 1967 war, or if it was just for show or even betrayal and conspiracies, that's not our topic right now, because that deserves an episode of its own. So let's keep focused on the main subject. After the defeat of 67, commonly known as the Nakba, the Zionists extended their occupation to Egypt's Sinai, along with Gaza, which was under Egyptian administration, and they also occupied the Syrian Golan Heights, and finally their occupation reached the West Bank. So naturally at that point the Palestinian resistance movements and the Fedayeen would move to the East Bank, which would become the new stage for their operations. Jordan allowed the resistance to establish bases on its land as a natural and retaliatory response to the Zionists who had occupied its territory. Egypt and Syria also began encouraging the Arab nations and inciting them to fund the resistance, led by the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was established in 1964, as we mentioned earlier, and of which the Fatah movement became an integral part. So, along with Fatah, my friend, the resistance factions operating from within Jordanian territory were grilling the occupation with a barbecue of Fedayeen operations, raids, incursions, and deep strikes into the heart of the occupation. At this point, the Zionist occupation decides to expand its occupied territory by entering Jordan, in order to take control of the eastern part of the bank as well, just like it took the West Bank. And the main objective was to eliminate the resistance movements there, especially Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization. And so, the occupation army advanced towards Jordan and crossed the Jordan River under the cover of heavy airstrikes by air forces. This happened on the morning of March 21st, 1968, heading toward the Jordan Valley. The Zionists went in thinking it was an easy mission. They'd go in, finish it quickly, and head back. After all, they had already tested the Arabs back in 48 and came out victorious in the Nakba, and the Arabs were tested again in 67 and suffered the Naksa. They thought it would be a breeze because Eastern Jordan is tiny and could be taken in just a few hours. And here was the very first real clash between the occupation forces and actual power in the region. Because in both 48 and 67, the Zionists were not actually facing any force to speak of. The Arab armies completely forgot or ignored the verse. Prepare against them whatever you can. And it was the battle of Karama, on the border of the village of Karama in eastern Jordan. And glory be to the one who arranged for this confrontation to take place in that location, so it would bear the same name as the village, and that its name would remain in history as the Battle of Karama, or the Battle of Honor. And here we can proudly say out loud that this was the first real victory of the resistance and the Arabs over the occupation. Soldiers of Jordanian army who really believed in their cause stood alongside the devoted first generation of the FAT movement and the Liberation Organization. They all stood united, well armed with the support from their Arab brothers and well funded. They stood strong and determined, and they wiped the occupation army off the ground. And if the occupation boasts about the 6-day war and claim that they came victorious from war in 6 days in the Naksa, well, the resistance, my friends, together with the Jordanian army, finished this war in just 50 minutes. Yeah, seriously, just like you heard, it was done in 50 minutes only. And astonishingly, the so-called invincible army was turned into a burnt pasta dish, just like when you forget the dish in the oven for 50 minutes and it burns. And they retreated to the Jordan River from where they came, leaving behind the bodies of their dead soldiers, laying beside their tanks and burned out armored vehicles. This shock led Haim Barlev, the chief of general staff at the time, and the one who came up with the idea of the sand barrier on the Suez Canal shore. It led him to make a statement to the Newsweek magazine that they indeed lost in this war, the 50-minute one, 3 times more than what they had lost in the June War, by which he meant the 1967 defeat. And of course, after the Zionists retreated, the resistance and the Jordanian army kept striking them and didn't stop until they completely withdrew from East Jordan a few days after the start of the battle. What's important is that after this conflict, the Arabs began to breathe the first signs of victory. They saw that the resistance was truly capable. It could actually achieve something, and the Palestine Liberation Organization gained momentum and started receiving support from all directions. Kuwait imposed a tax to support the resistance, and Lebanon collected $500,000 in donations to the resistance from Beirut alone in a single day. Moreover, Iraq and Syria provided the resistance combatants with training alongside their regular forces, and Algeria sent them tons of weapons. And during the month of March, when the Battle of Karama took place in 1968, 20,000 fighters joined the war effort. The movement further opened branches in 80 countries around the world, to the extent that King Hussein allowed them to be present in the capital, Amman. Other cities like Irbid, Zarqa and others became a hot spot for fighters, not to mention their presence in border areas and also in Jabal Amman. So much so that Wasfi al-Tal, the Prime Minister of Jordan at the time, said that Amman, the capital of Jordan, had become the Hanoi of the Arabs, in a reference to Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, where the Vietnamese resistance used to gather to strike against the Americans. Wasfi al-Tal was, by the way, later assassinated in Cairo, and I will let you know who assassinated him in a bit. And precisely here, the episode is about to begin. Or rather, the main story is about to start. Everything you just heard until now was just an introduction and a prelude. There's no doubt that weapons give a certain confidence and power, and over time, that can easily turn into arrogance and delusion. The resistance became like a kingdom of its own within the kingdom of Jordan. How is a police officer standing at a checkpoint with a light weapon supposed to stop a convoy armed with heavy weapons? There were entire camps full of fighters, my friend, like Al-Hussein Camp and Al-Wedat, that were entirely run by the resistance. They were the ones operating everything inside, including checkpoints, enforcement and punishment. It was something like an autonomy, and the Jordanian army and police wouldn't go near them and had no real authority over them. And clashes began between the Jordanian security forces, both army and police, and the many resistance factions. And at that time, in 1969, Arafat had officially taken over the leadership of the organization, following the resignation of the founder Ahmad al-Shukairi in 1967 after the Naksa. So King Hussein brought in Arafat and sat down with him to agree on a few broad guidelines that the resistance would commit to in order to preserve the authority of the Jordanian state. This agreement was known as the 7-Point Agreement, to keep the Palestinian organizations far from cities, to impose restrictions on the factions' movements, whereby they would need to inform Jordanian authorities and get permits to move within the country, to comply with the kingdom laws and avoid further clashes with security forces, and many other details. Unfortunately, Arafat couldn't compel the organizations to comply with these conditions, because some of them had split off after al-Shukairi's resignation and formed independent groups, while others merged and created completely new entities. They were still resistance movements, but not under Yasser Arafat's banner. And Sheikh Ahmed Yassin had a testimony about these events that could help you better understand how things were unfolding at the time.
Because I visited Jordan in '68 and met some of our youth from Gaza who were there. There was a simple young man who told me, "I've joined Fatah." So I said, "Yeah, that's good, but what exactly do you do?" He said, "I stopped some Jordanian officers on the road and made them get out." I said, "What? You're just a kid and you're having generals and officers get out of their cars and humiliating them? You just drove them away, my son. This kind of behavior isn't acceptable."
This kind of behavior isn't acceptable. Two major armed forces on the same land, and King Hussein was caught between a rock and a hard place. Either he expels the resistance from Jordan and ends Jordan's support for the Palestinian resistance and the honor that comes with it, or he lets them stay and risks losing his esteem in front of his people. Not only that, but his position was threatened to the point where his own army generals had started pressuring him to expel the resistance fighters. And that's when King Hussein visited US President Richard Nixon in March of the same year, 1969. And this visit was the straw that broke the camel's back. At the time, it was said that King Hussein had finally given up on the Palestinian cause and that his visit was to set an arrangement with Nixon to sell the resistance out. This became confirmed to the resistance after a US statement that stated that the conflict was nearing resolution and King Hussein had vowed to eradicate Fedayeen movements entirely in his territory. All this was happening while the situation kept escalating day by day in Jordan. 500 clashes between the factions and the Jordanian security forces. And when King Hussein returned, he announced the American initiative, which the factions completely rejected. They even held demonstrations and protests against it in the streets of Jordan. These escalating tensions led to an attempted assassination of King Hussein after he returned in June 1970. After that, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, with its headquarters in Jordan itself, moved into action. The front hijacked 4 planes headed to America on September 6, 1970, and they succeeded in bringing 2 of those planes down on Jordanian grounds. Then, a few days later, on the 9th of September of the same year, they hijacked another plane, adding it to the other 2 already in Jordan. So now they had 3 hijacked planes with hostages. This resulted in international negotiations between Switzerland, Germany, and Britain, with the resistance inside Jordan to free the hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners. And indeed, the front achieved part of what they wanted, like Britain releasing Layla Khaled, a member of the Popular Front. The planes were blown up on Jordanian soil, but they were already empty of any passengers. The front had already taken the hostages out. And on top of that, prominent figures in the resistance, like Salah Khalaf Abu Iyad and George Habash, were demanding to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy and calling for it to be transformed into a democratic state. What democracy are you talking about? And it was an American plan, my friend, put together by Kissinger, who was working at the time as the US National Security Advisor in 1970. Yeah, once again, the Americans were the ones who orchestrated everything. America intimidated the Syrians, Iraqis, and Egyptians against any reaction should King Hussein begin attacking the resistance. They told them, if you intervene, we will intervene too. Because the Americans knew very well that those 3 would be the first to be upset over the resistance. And so indeed, my friend, the ground was set for the major confrontation between the Jordanian army and the Palestinian resistance factions. And unfortunately, even though the real enemy was right there in front of their eyes, but the only 2 Arab forces that had defeated this common enemy, they turned away from their enemy and started breaking each other down. At dawn on September 17, 1970, the Jordanian army left its barracks heading toward the cities where the factions were located, and they surrounded them from every side. The Jordanian forces began executing the plan Jawhar, which involved shelling with artillery and airstrikes, with tanks advancing in front of them. There were also some Syrian forces present on Jordanian soil, either to support the resistance or for training purposes. These forces stood with the factions against the Jordanian army, but the storm was fierce, and Jordan was delivering a blow with no intention of pulling back. It was reported that King Hussein contacted the Zionists during the fighting and asked them to strike Syria, so that the Syrian army would get preoccupied with them and pull back its forces that were supporting the factions. You'll find sources detailing the Zionist involvement in these events in the description below. From September 17 to the 27th, the fighting between the two sides didn't stop. That's what led some historical sources that documented these events to describe them as the Jordanian Civil War. At least approximately 3,400 people were killed from the resistance, their families, and also innocent civilians who had nothing to do with it. And 567 soldiers from the Jordanian army were also killed, or at least that many. This confrontation was truly a tragedy, one really deserving of the name of the Black September. And although I usually refrain from cursing time, but I think the word black here is rather a description of this dark situation you're hearing about and trying to grasp. An extraordinary Arab summit was then held in Cairo to contain the situation, but of course, you all know what happened there. The infamous nice lunch with the couple of cigarettes and the nice cup of coffee before flying back home without any real action on the ground to resolve the problem. At that particular time, Sudan was ruled by General Jafar Nimeri. The man was a bit too enthusiastic about his role and traveled to Jordan and met Yasser Arafat in his hideout. He actually managed then to take him along in his convoy and safely and securely deliver him to the Egyptian embassy in Amman. He was then followed by Saad al-Abdullah, the Kuwaiti Minister of Defense, who secretly arrived at the Egyptian embassy, took Arafat from there and smuggled him out of Jordan. And indeed, Arafat was among the Kuwaiti delegation, disguised in Kuwaiti attire, clean-shaven and all that. But honestly, my friend, it was all for show. Jordan knew about the plan and let it happen. They actually let Arafat leave with them on a plane to Cairo because the goal in the first place was to get him out of Jordanian territory. And from Cairo, on September 27th, an announcement was made in the presence of King Hussein next to Arafat, with Abdel Nasser between them at the Arab League regarding the ceasefire. And by the way, Jamal Abdel Nasser died the very next day on September 28, 1970, while the guests were still in town and Arafat was still in Cairo. And that's it, my friend. The Palestinian factions were expelled one after the other in the following months under the leadership of Wasfi al-Tal, the Jordanian Prime Minister, and the resistance exited through Syria and eventually moved and settled in Lebanon. There, FAT established itself when the Black September organization arrived to Lebanon in 1971, which later carried out the assassination of Wasfi al-Tal in the same year of 1971. He was assassinated in the city of Cairo on the date of November 28, 1971. And the organization also carried out its most famous operation the following year. The Munich operation that we talked about in another episode in 1972 in Germany, along with many other operations. This pretty much wraps up the story in the shortest time possible. But the point that might stand out in your mind amid all these events is that victory over occupation can only be achieved by force and union. In the Battle of Karama, when the Arabs supported each other and fulfilled the role expected of them, and the brothers stood together and united for just 50 minutes, there was no defeat except when there was negligence, hatred, discord, and betrayal. And in short, the occupation plays half the role of evil in this story, and we are, unfortunately, the ones who fill the other half here. And to Allah we belong, and to Him we shall return. That's it, believer. Assalamu alaikum.